An old tale, a lost treasure, and a secret so deep it could tear a family apart with hatred and betrayal. When the discovery of a long-forgotten manuscript shook the Mallister estate to its core, nothing remained the same. Faces changed, secrets were exposed, but that was just the beginning. Could the dark mystery ever be solved, or would every attempt only deepen the wounds and regrets that could never truly heal? The wind howled through the cracks of my office window, carrying the bitter chill of Edinburgh's January night, as I sat back, eyes tracing the snowflakes swirling against the darkening sky. It was the kind of evening that made you feel as though the city itself was holding its breath. I'd barely begun to let my mind wander, lost in the eerie stillness, when the abrupt knock at the door shattered the silence. The man who stepped in looked like he'd been dragged through a storm, haggard, eyes wide with worry, clutching a telegram as though it were his only lifeline. His hands trembled, as if the news he bore was enough to turn any sane man to stone. Without a word he passed me the telegram, the paper crackling in the stillness of the room. I tore it open, and the message on the yellowed sheet struck with the force of a fist. Urgent, Burns manuscript in danger. Come immediately, McAllister. It wasn't long, but it hit me hard, a punch to the gut that left me breathless. The McAllisters, a name known throughout the Highlands, their sprawling estates and ancient clan pride, made them kings in their own right. And now they were in trouble. The rumors of a lost Robert Burns manuscript had been everywhere lately, speculation flying from every corner of the tabloids, whispers of a treasure discovered deep within their vaults. But treasures, I knew, brought out more than admiration. They attracted predators. I locked eyes with the messenger. "When did this come through?" I asked. "Not an hour ago, Miss Mel," he replied, voice barely a whisper. "They said it was urgent." I gave him a coin for his trouble, and as he left I felt the weight of the telegram settle in my stomach. I read it again, and something about the phrase "troubling rumors" gnawed at me. In my line of work that usually meant money, pride, or something far darker. The McAllisters were notorious for hoarding anything of value, especially relics of Scotland's ancient past. If they had found an authentic Burns manuscript, then it was certain that many eyes would turn toward it, eyes that wouldn't hesitate to cause trouble. I tucked the telegram into my handbag, shrugged on my coat, and set off. Time was not on my side. The late afternoon train from Waverley Station was the last, its steam hissing like an old warhorse preparing for one final battle. The compartments were nearly empty, a sparse crowd on this cold winter's day. Outside the pale sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the snowy streets, while the city seemed to retreat into itself, preparing for the night ahead. As the train sped through the countryside, my thoughts were a whirl of possibilities. This manuscript wasn't just a piece of paper, it was power, a potential goldmine for anyone who could claim it. The McAllisters swore the manuscript was genuine, penned by Burns himself, but I knew that kind of claim always brought its own set of dangerous questions. Who stood to gain if it vanished? Who would go so far as to destroy it, or would destroy the family to keep it hidden? There were rumors of blackmail, of long-buried family secrets. Every clan had their skeletons, and the McAllisters, with all their pride and wealth, had more than most. The hills outside the train window were dusted with snow, their slopes twisting and turning, hiding secrets within their depths. The sky had deepened to a bruise of purple, and the cold crept deeper into my bones, the kind of cold that felt like it was inside me, gnawing at my instincts. By the time night had fully settled in, the train screeched to a halt at a tiny, almost forgotten station. A sign barely visible in the dim lantern light marked its name. The air was sharp and biting as I stepped out, greeted by a driver whose face was taut with unease, holding a lantern as though he were about to deliver bad news. Wordlessly I climbed into the waiting car, the crunch of the tires on packed snow the only sound. We drove in silence, the only illumination coming from the flickering lantern, as the road twisted into the heart of the Highlands. The deeper we went, the more I felt like we were heading towards something far darker, something that wouldn't be solved without blood being spilled. As we rounded the final bend, the McAllister estate appeared, a looming silhouette against the snowstorm, its windows flickering with light, its heavy oak doors standing like a silent sentinel. Even from this distance, it felt like a fortress, guarding secrets I was about to uncover. The telegram had warned of troubling rumors, but I knew better than to trust rumors. They were always either bigger lies or smaller truths, and my job was to find out which was which. This place, this estate, held more than just a manuscript. It held a story, and I intended to find it, no matter how dark the road ahead became. The biting cold of the Highlands gripped me as I stepped out of the car, the snow crunching beneath my boots with a sound like broken glass. I pulled my collar tight against the wind, feeling the chill sink deep into my bones, seeping through my clothes as if it had its own agenda. The McAllister estate loomed ahead, shrouded in mist, its towering silhouette barely visible through the thick snow swirling in the air. Lanterns flickered, their dim light casting eerie shadows along the gravel driveway, a faint glow in the blackness, like distant stars struggling to pierce the dark. Somewhere inside the house, the mournful sound of a lone bagpipe played, its haunting melody rising and falling with the wind, reverberating off the stone walls of the estate. It felt less like music, and more like a summons from the past, a warning perhaps, or a memory of something long buried, waiting to resurface. The estate, ancient and imposing, stood like a sentinel, guarding its secrets behind its cold stone facade. I climbed the steps slowly, my breath forming clouds in the freezing air, my heart thumping a little faster with every step. The door swung open before I could knock, the warmth that greeted me almost overwhelming, a stark contrast to the cold biting night outside. But even inside, the atmosphere was tense, thick with unspoken words. The grand foyer stretched out before me, its high ceilings arching over the room, the flickering candlelight, casting long shifting shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. The polished marble floors gleamed under the soft light, but there was an underlying coldness, a sense that this place, for all its grandeur, was no home at all. It was a mausoleum, full of old memories and buried truths. A man appeared from the shadows, his posture stiff, his face impassive. "Miss Marple?" he asked, his voice low, almost a whisper, as if the very walls of the house might be listening. I nodded, reaching into my coat to pull out the telegram that had brought me here. It felt more like a badge than a piece of paper. "Mr. Addington," the man introduced himself, butler to the McAllister family. He spoke with the formality of someone who had been trained to serve, though his eyes told another story. Those eyes seemed to know something, to carry the weight of 1,000 secrets. Without waiting for a response, he motioned for me to follow him, his footsteps silent on the cold floor as we passed through the grand hallway. As we moved past the ancestral portraits, haughty, stiff-backed men and women with eyes full of judgment and expectation, I couldn't help but feel their presence. Their painted gazes followed me, as if they were waiting for me to make a mistake, to step out of line. Each portrait seemed to carry its own weight of secrets, a history of this family that had long since gone quiet, but had never truly been buried. We turned into a narrow hallway, the cold air thickening, pressing in on me as though the very walls were closing in. Mr. Addington stopped in front of a glass case, the soft glow of a single lamp above it casting a delicate light on the contents, a slender folio of yellowed pages. At first glance, it looked harmless enough, just another old document, perhaps a relic of a time long gone. But the rumors had painted a different picture. This, they said, was a newly discovered manuscript by Robert Burns himself, one of the last untold secrets of the great poet. And if the rumors were true, it was worth more than most could imagine, a treasure that could make or break fortunes. I leaned in closer, my breath fogging up the glass, my fingers itching to touch the pages, to feel the weight of history pressing against my palm. There was something about the way the light caught the surface of the case, something in the tiny scratch near the corner of the glass that made my instincts flare. It was too small to matter, at least that's what anyone else would have thought, but I knew better. In this game, nothing was ever as it seemed. As I studied the manuscript, my mind raced through the implications. If the McAllisters had discovered this manuscript, it could change everything for them. Power, wealth, influence, all could be theirs. But that kind of value also brought danger, and with danger came betrayal. I could already feel the tension in the air, thick and suffocating, as if the house itself were holding its breath, waiting for something to snap. Lord Alistair's voice broke through my thoughts, deep and commanding, his presence heavy in the room. "I trust your journey was pleasant, Miss Marple." His eyes, cold and calculating, never left mine, as if he was trying to read me in the same way one would read an open book. Beside him, Lady Fiona McAllister stood with a tight, forced smile, her elegance masking the storm I could see brewing behind her eyes. She was a woman on the edge, her composure just barely holding together, a facade ready to crumble at the slightest provocation. Behind them their children, Rosalind and Cameron, stood like statues, their faces carefully blank, but their eyes betraying them. Cameron's gaze flicked around the room restlessly, as if he were expecting trouble to burst from the walls at any moment. Rosalind, on the other hand, stood with the kind of perfect poise that suggested she had long since learned the art of hiding her true emotions. But I could see through the masks they wore. The tension between them all was palpable, a low hum of barely contained secrets and unspoken fears. Lord Alistair's greeting was brief, formal, and full of weight, though his words held back more than they revealed. Lady Fiona, with her brittle smile, motioned for Mr. Addington to guide me deeper into the house, and I followed, feeling the weight of their eyes on my back. Mr. Addington led me through the winding hallways, each turn seeming to take us deeper into the heart of the estate, into the heart of their web of lies. The portraits of dead ancestors loomed over us, their eyes full of judgment, as if they too knew that this was not just about a manuscript. No, this was something far darker, something that had been building for years. As we reached a side corridor, the air grew even colder, the darkness thicker. Mr. Addington stopped in front of another glass case, the soft light illuminating the manuscript, Robert Burns' secret treasure. I bent closer, my eyes narrowing, my pulse quickening. This wasn't just about history, it was about power, and power had a way of twisting people, making them do things they'd never dreamed they were capable of. I knew that whatever was hidden within these walls wasn't just a treasure, it was a key, and I was here to unlock it. The glass case gleamed faintly in the dim light, but my eyes were drawn to the corner, where a tiny, almost imperceptible scratch marred its surface. It was hardly noticeable unless you were looking for trouble, but I had learned long ago that trouble rarely made itself obvious. I turned to Mr. Addington, my voice calm but pointed. "How long has that been there?" I asked, watching as his gloved hands fidgeted nervously at his sides. He hesitated, the briefest flicker of uncertainty crossing his face before he muttered, "I just noticed it this afternoon, ma'am." His gaze dropped to the floor, avoiding mine, and I studied him for a moment, feeling the weight of his nervousness settle in the air. But there was more to him than met the eye. Butlers saw everything, but rarely spoke of it. Yet, in my experience, they were rarely the biggest threat. Instead, they became convenient scapegoats when the trouble started. Still, I tucked the detail away, unwilling to dismiss it just yet. Then I heard a slight cough. A young footman, his face pale as chalk, stood by the edge of the lamp's glow. Gregory, if I recalled his name correctly, kept his hands clasped tightly in front of him, a subtle tremor betraying his composure. When I looked his way, his eyes quickly flicked to the floor. That told me everything. He knew something he wasn't ready to share. Either that or he was putting on the most convincing show of fear I'd ever seen. Either way, it was a clear signal that there were secrets here, and they were very much alive. I gave a soft, almost imperceptible sigh, and took a step back from the glass case. "Quite the treasure you're guarding," I remarked, my voice steady, though my mind was racing. Mr. Addington cleared his throat, his tone wavering for just a moment, before he quickly sealed his lips again. Yes, Miss Marple, quite. The words hung in the air, thick with unspoken meaning. Gregory stood motionless beside us, casting nervous glances at the case, at Mr. Addington, and then at me. I gave the glass one last glance, noticing the faint, almost mocking glint of the scratch that seemed to smile at me from the surface. This was no ordinary case, and certainly not an ordinary manuscript. I could feel the pressure in the room, the tension thick and sticky, as if something was waiting to explode. I needed rest, but more than that, I needed to think about that scratch, about the furtive glances, and about the words left unsaid. This job was turning into something much bigger than I had anticipated. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't the only one hunting answers in this house. As I turned to Mr. Addington, my tone firm with finality, I said, "Best show me where I'll be staying." The moment hung between us, charged with unspoken questions. I could almost feel the air itself vibrating with anticipation, as though the walls of the manor were about to whisper their secrets. That manuscript was worth more than I cared to admit, and if the rumors were true, it would attract every sort of person, from treasure hunters to those with darker motives. I woke the next morning to a grey sky, and a biting wind that rattled the windows like a warning. By mid-afternoon, the manor was in chaos, servants scurrying about like frantic crows, polishing silver platters, straightening tablecloths, making sure everything was perfect. Lady Fiona moved among them, her eyes scanning every detail with sharp precision, lips pressed into a thin line of concentration. Her movements were those of a woman who was used to being in control, but I could see it, the crack in the facade, the worry that flickered behind her perfectly controlled smile. She had more than just a dinner to worry about. She had the weight of her family's reputation on her shoulders. If this Burns night banquet didn't go off without a hitch, there would be no saving the McAllister name. As she caught sight of me, she forced a smile, trying to smooth the worry from her brow. "Miss Marple, I trust you've found the estate comfortable?" she asked, but I could hear the edge of anxiety in her voice. "As comfortable as a lady could hope," I replied, my tone neutral, as I took in the chaos of the preparations. I didn't miss the quick glance she threw at the polished silver candelabras and the lines of sparkling crystalware. Everything had to be perfect. "You've a busy evening ahead," I added, watching her eyes flicker to the guests she had yet to impress. "It must be perfect," she murmured, but then as if the pressure became too much, she turned away and barked an order at a footman who was struggling with a linen tablecloth. I wandered through the corridors, the hustle of the back rooms in stark contrast to the quiet stillness of the main hall. But even here, the air was thick with tension, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was out of place. I paused in front of the glass case again, my eyes drawn to the Burns manuscript. It sat there, quiet and still, as if it were waiting for someone to unlock its secrets. The faint scratch on the glass caught the light again, like a silent accusation. Whoever had made that mark had been testing the case for weaknesses, and that told me everything I needed to know. Someone was already trying to get in. What did they know that I didn't? What were they willing to risk to get their hands on the manuscript? One thing was for sure, this wasn't just about a treasure, this was a game, and the stakes were far higher than anyone had anticipated. The McAllister family was teetering on the edge of something dangerous, and I was about to find out just how far they were willing to go to protect their secrets. The evening descended like a velvet curtain, and the foyer shimmered with candlelight, casting long shadows that danced across the polished floors. The murmur of aristocratic voices mingled with the sharp clink of glasses, and the scent of fresh pine from the tall trees outside wrapped around the room like a ghost. Names floated in the air as grand and as hollow as the manor itself: minor nobility, academics with an eye for Scottish antiquities, and a few local businessmen eager to rub elbows with the McAllisters. The bagpipes struck up a sharp, haunting tune, filling the space with an echo of something ancient and forlorn. If Lord Alistair's aim was spectacle, it had been achieved in spades. Cameron, stiff and rigid, was standing by a marble column, nervously folding and unfolding a scrap of paper, some Burns poem he was meant to recite, as I'd heard. The smile he forced was a thin veil over a nervous wreck. A part of him, it seemed, longed for the night to be over before it had even begun. He glanced at Lady Fiona across the room, her tense smile flickering as she conversed with some of the guests, her eyes darting anxiously from face to face. If he delivered that poem well, perhaps the rumors would die down, perhaps the McAllisters would emerge from the wreckage of their reputation. His voice was tight, like a man about to jump off a cliff, but hoping against hope that he might fly. If I do this well, maybe Father can convince them we're as solid as ever. Rosalind, a vision in a gown of deep velvet, floated past us, arm entwined with that of her fiancé, Charles Montgomery, a man whispered about in the society pages. He turned to me, his handshake firm and overly confident. "Miss Marple, I presume," he said, his gaze flicking briefly to the glass case. I could tell he wasn't here for the haggis, but for something far more valuable. "Curiosity is part of my job," I replied, keeping my tone casual, though every fiber of my being screamed that I needed to stay alert. Cameron cleared his throat, and with a strained nod, excused himself, leaving me alone with the Montgomerys. There was something about the tension between them that made my skin prickle, too thick, too palpable. A few moments later, the room fell silent as Lord Alistair led the way to the dining table. Footmen carrying trays of whiskey and wine passed by like ghosts, their eyes cast downward. The piper's tune reached a high, triumphant note, and then, like a dagger through the heart of the celebration, a scream echoed from the hallway, a sound of pure terror that ripped through the air. Lady Fiona's voice, strangled and panicked, reached us before the crowd surged toward the source. My legs moved before I could even think, and I pushed through the gathering throng, following the echoes of her cry. When I reached the glass case, I froze. The Burns manuscript, the very heart of this grand spectacle, was gone, vanished. In its place was nothing but that scratch on the glass, gleaming under the dim light like an accusation. Lady Fiona was standing there, her hand pressed to her mouth, eyes wide with shock, while Lord Alistair's usual composure crumbled in an instant. Cameron stood by, utterly bewildered, his eyes scanning the empty space, disbelief etched on his face. The crumpled poem, the one he was supposed to recite, lay discarded on the floor. Charles and Rosalind hovered nearby, their faces ashen, and in a whisper, someone muttered, "It's stolen." I just stared at the empty case, feeling a cold knot form in my stomach. The trouble I'd sensed since my arrival wasn't just a vague feeling anymore, it was as real as the shattered glass under my feet. Taking a slow breath, I exhaled quietly, letting the weight of the situation settle in. The theft wasn't just a crime, it was a carefully orchestrated strike at the McAllister legacy itself. The air was thick with the kind of tension that could crack the walls if it went on much longer. By the time dinner was served, the dining hall was a strange mix of anticipation and dread. The bagpipes droned from the corner, their mournful wail hanging over the gathered crowd like a shadow. Candles flickered along the grand table, casting distorted reflections in the crystal goblets, and giving the room an almost surreal glow. The haggis, tonight's true centerpiece, sat at the head of the table, steam rising from it in thin tendrils, beckoning like some dark, ancient ritual. I found myself wedged between chattering aristocrats in tartan sashes and scholars who kept glancing over their shoulders, as though fearing someone or something was about to leap out from the shadows. Cameron caught my eye from across the table, the folded poem still clutched tightly in his hand. His pale face betrayed nothing, but the effort to smile was painfully obvious. Lady Fiona, dressed in crimson, took her place at Lord Alistair's side. With a regal tilt of her head, she signaled for quiet, and for a moment the room held its breath. The piper's melody swelled, a dramatic crescendo, but before it could reach its peak, another scream, raw and filled with fear, cut through the air. All eyes turned to the source, the sound freezing everyone in place. This time, there was no mistake. The McAllisters' carefully constructed world had just cracked, and the real mystery was only beginning. The music, once soaring with the triumph of the pipes, softened into a single mournful drone. Lord Alistair, ever the epitome of grace, raised his glass, his voice booming across the grand hall. "Friends, on this Burns night, let us raise our glasses to Scotland's greatest poet, and to the heritage we hold dear." The room responded in unison, glasses rising in a shimmering wave as laughter rang out, warm and easy. The pipes roared to life again, cutting through the noise, leading into the traditional address to the haggis, but then, like a shot fired in a quiet room, Lady Fiona's voice cracked through the merriment, sharp and panicked. The glass slipped from her hand, shattering on the floor with a sound that seemed to freeze the room. "It's gone," she gasped, her eyes wide with disbelief. "The manuscript, it's gone." The music died instantly. Chairs scraped the floor as guests leapt to their feet, murmuring in confusion, a wave of chaos surging through the room. The feast, once the focal point of the evening, was forgotten in an instant. A servant rushed forward, but Lady Fiona pulled away, her face ashen, terror written in every line of her expression. My feet moved of their own accord, pushing through the crowd toward the hallway that led to the display case. Lord Alistair's rigid form cut through the throng, his shoulders taut under the weight of his formal jacket, and Cameron, pale and tense, was close behind, the wrinkled scrap of Burns' poem clutched tightly in his hand. We reached the glass case, and the overhead light flickered coldly over the empty space where the priceless manuscript had once rested. The absence was more profound than the mere lack of pages. It was an ominous void that seemed to swallow the room. The faint scratch on the glass, that slight but telling mark, remained, unbroken, untouched, and accusing. No sign of forced entry, nothing but the illusion of safety shattered. Whoever had taken the manuscript had done so with the precision of a master thief, unseen and unheard, slipping through our midst like a shadow. Lady Fiona's scream still echoed in the corners of the room, but her terror quickly turned to fury. "Lock the doors," Lord Alistair commanded, his voice cutting through the rising panic. "No one leaves this estate until we find the thief." Footmen scrambled to seal every exit as the guests began to press in, their whispered conversations swirling around us like an eerie wind. I stepped closer to the case, my breath fogging the glass as I studied the scratch. There was no obvious sign of forced entry, but something about the mark was wrong. It was too neat, too deliberate. Gregory, the footman, appeared at my side, his face pale and drawn, and behind him Mr. Addington strode in, his eyes cold and calculating. I motioned them forward, lowering my voice. "We need to secure every corridor, every passage. Check the windows, the thief could still be inside." Gregory nodded quickly, his legs unsteady, as if the weight of the task was already too much for him. Mr. Addington, ever composed, pulled a set of keys from his pocket, the sound of metal jangling sharp and discordant in the stillness. "I'll coordinate with the staff. You do a thorough sweep, Miss Marple," he said, his voice clipped. The guests were becoming restless, their nerves fraying with every passing moment. A woman in a high-collared gown gasped, her voice quivering. "Are we locked in here?" A grizzled scholar grumbled from the corner. "I have important work to present tomorrow. This is absurd." I turned toward the crowd, meeting their eyes one by one. "Yes," I said, my tone calm but firm. "You're all suspects until we find the manuscript." Silence followed, thick and heavy, hanging over the room like a storm about to break. Then, as if on cue, a dozen voices rose in protest, each person clamoring to declare their innocence. Lady Fiona stood off to the side, trembling, her hands wringing together, while Rosalind tried to comfort her, speaking softly in her ear. Cameron, his face drained of color, crumpled the poem in his fist, his anxiety now a visible gnawing presence. Charles Montgomery, ever the picture of polished manners, now showed the first cracks in his carefully constructed facade. Lord Alistair turned to me, his face a mask of determination. "Miss Marple, I want the manuscript back, and I want the thief found. No more delays." I nodded, my own mind already racing through the possibilities. The tension that clung to the estate was palpable, thick enough to choke the air from my lungs. There was no time to waste. The first step was to gather clues, to sift through the stories the guests were telling, and to see who might crack under the pressure. I turned to him, my voice steady but filled with the weight of the task ahead. "Rest assured, Lord Alistair, we'll find your missing treasure, one way or another." The butler's pantry smelled faintly of soap and something darker, something like fear. Gregory stood by the counter, clutching a dishcloth so tightly that his knuckles were white. He wouldn't meet my eyes at first, and I couldn't decide if it was nerves or something more. There was guilt in the air, and I wasn't sure if it was his or mine for being so damn close to the truth. I gave Gregory a moment, letting the silence settle between us like a thick fog. It's always more revealing than an interrogation. Finally, his voice broke, weak and hesitant. "I didn't take the manuscript, Miss Marple." I leaned in closer, letting my gaze sharpen. "Then how about you tell me what you did do?" His eyes fluttered shut, and his shoulders slumped, as though the weight of his words was too much to bear. "I overheard Mr. Cameron and Miss Rosalind arguing the day before the banquet," he murmured, as though confessing a sin. "They were fighting about money, something about the estate not being able to keep up appearances." He winced, rubbing his temple like the memory pained him. "They were furious with each other, accusing one another of letting the family down." I studied his face, searching for cracks in his story. "That's a pretty heavy conversation for siblings. Why keep it to yourself?" His throat worked nervously, and he gulped. "I didn't want any trouble, Miss Marple." He paused, as if the next part were harder to say. "There's something else." His ears turned pink with embarrassment, and he shifted uncomfortably. "I'm involved with someone in this house," he confessed, the words coming out in a strained whisper, "but I can't say who. If it got out, if the McAllisters found out." He trailed off, the fear creeping into his voice. "I'd lose my position here, and more." I raised an eyebrow, leaning in slightly. "Afraid I'll use that against you?" His face twisted with apprehension. "I'm afraid of everyone, miss. The McAllisters can be fierce, and if they found out I'd been sneaking around behind closed doors," his voice faltered. "I swear, I didn't steal the manuscript. I wouldn't even know how." His earnestness almost seemed convincing, but I wasn't going to take anyone's word at face value, not in a place like this. "All right," I said, stepping back, "keep your eyes open, and your mouth shut. At least until we get to the bottom of this." Gregory nodded quickly, relief flooding his face, though I wasn't sure if it was because he was telling the truth, or just too scared of getting caught in a lie. Either way, I'd find out soon enough. I slipped out of the pantry, letting him stew in his own nervous confessions, and made my way toward the estate's archives. The drafty wing above the kitchens was nearly forgotten, a dark and forlorn place where old ledgers and receipts gathered dust like secrets buried in time. One flickering bulb hung from the ceiling, casting long shadows over rows of shelves, laden with papers so old they might crumble at the slightest touch. I had a hunch, the McAllisters' financial troubles could explain a lot, and if they were trying to hide something, it would be buried here, in the official records. Sure enough, after rummaging through dusty volumes, I found it, a ledger with Lord Alistair's name embossed on the spine. I opened it carefully, the pages crackling under my fingers. The entries began innocently enough: payments to staff, upkeep of the estate, the occasional extravagant purchase. But then halfway through, I found them pages ripped clean out, as though someone had tried to erase their existence. A chill ran through me, the damp air of the archives pressing in on my skin. Those missing pages were no accident, they were deliberate, and the gaps they left behind screamed of hidden truths. If the McAllisters were struggling for cash, I could see how a priceless manuscript, like the one that had vanished, could solve their problems in an instant. But the missing pages could also point to something darker, like a debt so vast it threatened to swallow the entire family. Either way, the money troubles ran deeper than whispered rumors. They had roots, dark secrets, and someone was desperately trying to keep them buried. An hour later, I had gathered the McAllisters in the drawing room, all under one ornate ceiling, each one a study in restraint. Lord Alistair stood by the fireplace, his hands locked behind his back, his posture rigid, as if he were preparing for inspection. Lady Fiona sat perched on a satin-covered chair, her body stiff, her gaze flicking nervously toward me. Cameron hovered by the window, his posture restless, tension radiating from his back. Rosalind, ever composed, sat quietly, her ankles crossed and her eyes fixed on the intricate Persian rug beneath her feet. I laid out my findings, showing them the ledger with the missing pages and the damning evidence of their financial struggles. Lady Fiona's eyes flickered with panic at the mention of the missing pages, while Lord Alistair's face hardened, his jaw tightening. "That ledger pertains to private family matters," he said, his voice cool and dismissive. "It has no relevance to this theft." I shrugged, trying to keep my tone casual, though the weight of the moment pressed down on me. Private or not, those missing pages suggest something more is at stake than just a manuscript. I paused, letting my words sink in. Gregory overheard a heated argument between Cameron and Rosalind, something about money. Care to explain? Cameron threw up his hands, his face flushing with anger. "We argued, yes, we're siblings, we fight. But I swear, I never touched that blasted manuscript." Rosalind continued to stare at the rug, her silence speaking volumes, while Lady Fiona's lips pressed into a tight thin line, her gaze flicking between the others. She looked like she might faint at any moment. The tension in the room was palpable, thick with suspicion and fear, and I knew that somewhere, in all of this, the truth was waiting to be uncovered. The tension in the room was palpable, thick enough to choke on. Each glance exchanged between the McAllisters was heavy with unsaid words, as though their very thoughts could expose them. Finally I spoke, breaking the silence with a calm that I didn't quite feel. "All right," I said, choosing my words carefully, "I won't press the point any further, for now, but I strongly suggest we keep this under one roof. The longer those missing pages remain absent, the more suspicious it becomes." A wave of wariness swept over them, their expressions tightening, as though the weight of their hidden skeletons was pressing down on them all at once. There was something dark in the McAllister family closet, something so tangled that anyone willing to tear out pages to hide it would undoubtedly do far worse. That left me with two burning questions. How far had they gone already, and was that the same distance required to steal the manuscript? The answers weren't clear yet, but the heavy atmosphere in the drawing room hinted that I'd uncover them soon enough, if I could sift through the lies and lock doors before the truth slipped away for good. Later, Lady Fiona found me in the library, where the dying fire cast long, eerie shadows over the oak shelves. She looked like she had aged 5 years since we began this investigation, eyes rimmed red, lips pressed thin, her whole demeanor radiating fear. She locked the door behind us with trembling hands, and I knew this conversation would be more than just idle chatter. She started pacing, the tap of her heels against the stone floor echoing through the room in a jittery staccato. "Miss Marple," she said, halting abruptly, "I've carried this burden for far too long." Her eyes flickered to the half-burned logs in the fireplace, as if seeking comfort in the flames. "Years ago, when times were lean, Lord Alistair, my husband, persuaded me to, well, we did a terrible thing." She swallowed hard, and I saw a flash of regret in her eyes. "We forged Burns' memorabilia, little trinkets, letters, sold them to collectors at inflated prices. Just a few times, then we stopped. But the whispers, they've never gone away." She sank into an armchair, burying her face in her hands. This newly discovered manuscript was our chance at redemption. If it proved genuine, it could clear our names forever. But if it's found to be another forgery, we'd be ruined. Her voice faltered, and I let the gravity of her words hang in the air. Which means, I said quietly, whoever stole it might also plan to expose your past. Lady Fiona nodded, a single tear escaping despite her efforts at composure. It's tearing Alistair apart, and the children, she whispered, her jaw clenching with the effort of holding herself together. They have no idea what we did, and I'd rather they never know. I let the weight of her confession settle over me, the revelation of the forged memorabilia, adding a sharp new angle to the mystery. If the manuscript was real, the McAllisters could regain their honor. But if it was fake, or worse, if someone uncovered the forgeries they'd created long ago, their entire world would come crashing down. No wonder Lady Fiona looked like she'd seen a ghost. Shortly after, I cornered Cameron in a quiet antechamber off the main hall. He stood by a window, staring out at the snow-covered gardens, his face drawn with worry. "I hear you've been juggling debts," I said softly, my voice low and direct, "and that you might have eyed the manuscript as a quick payout." He spun around, guilt flooding his features, and exhaled a shaky breath, as if he'd been holding it in for far too long. "All right," he said, his voice strained, "I did think about it. My gambling, it got out of hand." He rubbed his face, as though the weight of his words was too much to bear. "A man from London said he'd buy the manuscript, no questions asked, if I could deliver it quietly. But you swear you didn't steal it?" I pressed, watching his every movement. He swiped a hand over his face, frustration and guilt warring in his expression. "No, I couldn't go through with it. My mother would never forgive me. Besides, I barely know how to open that damn glass case without setting off the whole household." His shoulders sagged in defeat. "But now I'm certain someone's trying to pin this on me. Whoever approached me, they might be orchestrating the whole thing, setting me up as the obvious suspect." Another twist, then. Cameron wasn't just a gambler in over his head. Someone was carefully laying the breadcrumbs to make him look guilty. The question now was who, and why. By the time night fell again, I began to visit the guest rooms, following my hunch that someone here might hold the key. One of them, an antique collector with a hawk-like gaze, was constantly eyeing the locked doors, cursing the inconvenience of the situation. Another was a literary scholar, quick to voice doubts about the manuscript's authenticity, a tactic that would undoubtedly drive the McAllister's price down if he intended to buy it cheap. But the most intriguing was Char Montgomery, Rosalind's smooth-talking fiancé, whose charm seemed to cover a multitude of sins. His manner was too polished, too rehearsed. Was he another player in this tangled web? The night had left its mark on the McAllister estate, a heaviness clinging to the air like smoke after a fire. Charles had been spotted slipping away from the crowd at Owen's last evening. He'd claimed a headache, but the housemaid had seen him near the service stairs long after midnight, moving with the careful precision of someone trying to stay unnoticed. Quiet footsteps, furtive glances over his shoulder, textbook suspicious behavior, if you ask me. I stood in the corridor, my hands on my hips, the puzzle pieces falling into place with an unsettling clarity. Maybe Charles had intended to secure the manuscript for himself. Maybe the scholar was trying to disprove its authenticity. Or perhaps the antique collector had plans to steal it. And let's not forget Cameron's shady contact, who might have infiltrated the estate for some deeper purpose. Each possibility added a layer to the growing web of deceit. One thing was certain: the circle of suspects was expanding, and the unnerving sensation that someone was watching my every move was only getting stronger. The deeper I dug, the more it felt like I was scraping at the surface of something far darker, something that someone in these halls was desperate to keep buried. As I walked the empty corridors, the moonlight filtering through tall windows, I was drawn once more to the library, a place where I knew secrets could be hidden in the quietest of corners. The room felt laden with whispers, the kind that only a keen ear could catch. I scanned the room, the beam of my flashlight sweeping across the rug near an oak bookcase. There at the edge, I spotted footprints, small, barely noticeable, but with a heavier tread than my own. They led to the far corner where dust-coated tomes lined the shelves like forgotten relics. Except one or two had been disturbed, just enough to catch my eye. My fingers slid over the spine of one thick book, pulling it out, and then a faint click echoed in the silence. The entire section swung inward, revealing a hidden compartment behind it. My pulse quickened as I crouched down and discovered a single scrap of parchment, torn at the edges, but unmistakably part of the missing Burns manuscript. My heart raced. Whoever had stolen the folio had hidden a piece of it within the estate itself. Why? Panic? A double cross? Either way, I had found what I needed. As I slipped the parchment into my coat pocket, I heard the faint scurrying of footsteps in the corridor. The housemaid passed by, eyes wide in surprise before she handed me a folded slip of paper. "Found this near Mr. Montgomery's door, Miss Marple," she whispered, glancing over her shoulder like she feared being overheard. She didn't want to cause a fuss, but when I unfolded the note, the corners were unmistakably from the same parchment as the piece I'd just found. Pieces of a puzzle snapped into place. Charles Montgomery, once just another face in the crowd, now had a bullseye on his back. I tracked him down in a small sitting room, the fire crackling softly in the hearth, casting dancing shadows on the walls. He looked up, startled, as I entered, and his face paled further when I placed the scrap of manuscript on the side table. "Mind telling me how this ended up so close to your door?" I asked, my voice low, steady. He tried to force a smile, but it was shaky, and his eyes betrayed him. "Goodness, Miss Marple, I have no idea. This is a terrible misunderstanding, I assure you." I leaned closer, placing the scrap down in front of him for emphasis. "Because I also found matching parchment hidden in the library, behind a bookcase. Seems to me someone had a reason to stash it away, and that someone points right to you." His face twitched, beads of sweat forming at his temple as he fiddled nervously with his cuffs. "I wasn't near the library that night. I had a headache and went straight to my room." "Funny," I said, taking another step forward, "because the housemaid saw you making rounds at odd hours, and you gave a different story to Lord Alistair, said you were in the music room." The silence that followed was thick with tension. His gaze flickered to the door, as if looking for a way out. "It's not what you think," he stammered, his voice rising slightly in pitch. "Maybe someone planted that parchment to frame me. Maybe," he trailed off, desperation creeping into his words. "From where I'm standing," I said, cutting him off, "you've got a lot to explain." I saw him open his mouth, but no words came out. That prickle of unease ran down my spine. This wasn't just a poorly crafted excuse. It was something bigger, something darker. This was the moment everything shifted. Charles Montgomery stood frozen, like a man who'd just realized the ground beneath him was crumbling, his every word now a desperate attempt to hold on to a sinking ship. The polished charm that had once been his armor had shattered, exposing the raw fear and guilt underneath. The facts were too clear now, too damning to ignore. This wasn't just a case of a man in the wrong place at the wrong time. Charles had been a willing participant in something far darker, pulling strings from the shadows, or, at the very least, complicit in the theft that had thrown the McAllister estate into chaos. The man who had once been a charming figure in society, a fiancé with a taste for Highland tradition, now stood accused of orchestrating the very betrayal that could rip apart the McAllister family. The once innocent-looking guest was now squarely at the heart of a plot that seemed to threaten everything. The third twist in the story slammed into place. Whether he had stolen the manuscript himself or hired someone to do it for him, one thing was certain: Charles Montgomery had a hand in this. And as I stood there, watching the facade of calm crack, I could feel the tension in the air thickening. It was no longer just about a missing manuscript. It was about a man trapped by his own lies, a man who had underestimated just how deep the web of his own deceit had grown. The night before, under the light of a pale moon that barely managed to illuminate the manor's vast halls, I had prowled the library once again. My flashlight had danced over the dusty spines of forgotten books, the beam catching the worn, uneven footprints in the carpet. There, hidden behind a row of time-worn tomes, I'd found it, an ancient, nearly disintegrated scrap of parchment that looked an awful lot like part of the missing Burns manuscript. My heart had hammered in my chest as I slipped it into my coat pocket. Someone had hidden it there, clearly not thinking it would ever be discovered. It wasn't a master thief's move, it was the panic of someone who thought they could hide their tracks, but wasn't quite clever enough. The thief had left a clue behind, and now, standing before Charles, I could see that he had left more than just that scrap. He'd left himself exposed. By the time I met him in the narrow sitting room, the weight of my discovery was heavy on my shoulders. I set the torn scrap of manuscript in front of him, my eyes unwavering. "Explain this," I demanded, my voice calm, almost too calm. Charles' response came quickly, but the shaky confidence behind it was unmistakable. "I have no idea how that ended up near my room," he stammered, his face pale, eyes flickering with panic. "It must be a setup." I leaned in, my gaze sharpening. "Is that so?" I asked, my voice colder now. "Because someone saw you wandering the halls long after midnight." His expression faltered for a second, just long enough to expose the truth he had been trying so hard to conceal. His mouth opened, but the lie he was about to tell died on his lips. I wasn't." His words were a weak attempt at an excuse, but it was clear he knew he was caught. The atmosphere in the room thickened, the silence stretching as I waited for him to break, to make a mistake. His eyes flicked around the room, first to the fireplace, then to the door, as if searching for some way out, some escape from the web he had woven. But there was no escape, not anymore. "Charles," I said, stepping closer, lowering my voice to something dark and dangerous. "I know about the American collector," I said, watching his face go ashen. "The one who promised you wealth in exchange for the Burns manuscript. Did you really think you could frame Cameron and walk away with the prize?" For a moment I thought he might break down entirely. His face turned gray as he realized just how much I knew. "How did you find out?" he rasped, his voice cracking under the weight of his guilt. I stepped back slightly, letting the silence hang between us for a beat. "I make it a point to ask the right questions," I said, crossing my arms. "You were sloppy, Charles. You left a trail of contradictions and lies. Once I found that piece of parchment, all it took was a bit of digging to connect you to the collector." The color drained from his face as he realized how close he was to being fully exposed. He swallowed hard, his eyes closing in shame. "I had no choice," he muttered, his voice barely audible. "I'm deeper in debt than you can imagine, deeper than Cameron even. My business dealings in the States, they went bad. This American offered me a way out. Just get my hands on the manuscript and shift the blame onto someone else. It seemed simple enough." He paused, his hands trembling as he spoke. "Cameron made the perfect scapegoat, and if I framed him, I could slip away, take the manuscript, and pay off all my debts. Rosalind and I could live in comfort, and the McAllisters would hush it up. Money and influence, silence." His voice cracked on the last word, and he slumped into an armchair, his head in his hands. The polished, arrogant mask he had worn for so long was gone, replaced by a broken man, shattered by his own choices. But there was no sympathy for him in my heart. The web he had spun was tangled and thick, and he was caught in it just as surely as Cameron had been. The real question now was whether he would continue to sink, or if he would finally face the consequences of his actions. The flicker of firelight danced in Charles Montgomery's eyes, and for a moment he tried to rebuild the mask of calm he had so carefully worn for months, but the weight of his situation was too much, and the cracks were too deep. There was nothing left now but desperation, an exposed man who had gambled everything and lost. "What are you going to do?" he whispered, his voice barely audible, trembling with the realization that everything was slipping away. I studied him, watching the way his gaze darted nervously, his fingers twitching as though he might try to escape, but there was nowhere left to run. "That depends on how cooperative you are," I said, my voice cold firm. "Where is the rest of the manuscript?" He hesitated, his eyes flicking to the door, perhaps imagining the mob of angry relatives and guests about to storm in and drag him away. Finally, he spoke, voice quivering with fear. "I stashed it in the old wine cellar. I was going to retrieve it once the heat died down." The words hung in the air like an unspoken confession, and I nodded slowly. The final piece of the puzzle had fallen into place. The manuscript was hidden away, waiting to be handed off to the American buyer, the money that Charles had so desperately needed, and all of it at the cost of throwing the blame on Cameron. A simple plan, executed poorly, and now it was falling apart under the weight of his lies. "Typical," I muttered to myself. The hidden secrets of old estates, of wealthy families with dark debts, they always stank of betrayal. Charles looked up at me, his desperation palpable. "I never meant to hurt Rosalind, please." "I'll do anything," he pleaded, his voice cracking under the strain of his fear and guilt. I studied him for a moment longer, wondering if his plea was genuine, or if it was simply a man fearing the consequences of his actions. Either way, the jig was up. "Start by telling her the truth," I said, my tone unyielding, "and be ready for whatever comes next. Once I lay this out for the family, you'll be lucky if the police aren't standing by with handcuffs." Charles wilted in the chair, his hands clenched so tightly his knuckles went white. "God help me," he whispered, and for a moment it almost sounded like a prayer. But there was no sympathy to be found here, no forgiveness. The silence that followed was thick with the finality of what was to come. I turned and walked out, leaving him to his thoughts, the crackling fire the only sound in the room, as the realization that his grand scheme was over began to settle in. The great hall was colder than it should have been, despite the roaring fires in the massive stone hearth. Rows of chairs had been arranged in front of the raised platform at the far end of the hall, where once upon a time, minstrels might have played their tunes for Highland lords. Now it was the stage for the final act of a twisted drama. The house staff, the McAllister family, and the most prominent guests filtered in, murmurs of nervous anticipation rising in the air. Candlelight flickered in the shadows, casting long wavering shapes against the stone walls that had witnessed centuries of secrets. I stood by the hearth, my pulse steady, my breath calm, too calm. This was it. The moment when everything would be laid bare. I had studied every angle, asked the right questions, followed the trail, and now it was time to reveal the truth. Charles stood at the back of the room, half hidden in the shadows beside Rosalind. He looked like a man waiting for the floor to open up and swallow him whole. His face was pale, his eyes wild with panic. Lord Alistair and Lady Fiona took their seats in the front row, her red-rimmed eyes betraying the anguish she'd been trying to hide, his jaw set like granite. Cameron hovered near them, arms folded, his posture stiff with anger and disbelief. The air was thick with tension, everyone knowing that something monumental was about to unfold. "Thank you all for gathering," I said, my voice cutting through the murmur of the crowd. "We've been chasing shadows ever since the manuscript disappeared, but tonight I can shed light on the matter." The room fell utterly still, every breath suspended in the silence. I drew a deep breath and pulled out the folded scrap of parchment from my coat pocket. "This torn fragment is from the missing Burns manuscript," I said, holding it up for everyone to see. "I discovered it hidden behind a secret bookcase in the library, a piece someone hastily stashed away, probably not thinking it would be found." The room stirred, the murmur of surprise spreading quickly, and I could see Charles' face drain of color as he froze, pinned under my gaze. "Parts of this fragment turned up near Mr. Montgomery's room," I continued, turning my eyes toward him. "When confronted with the evidence, he claimed ignorance, but let's lay out the facts." I nodded toward Cameron, who stepped forward. Cameron had debts, and Charles here, the perfect gentleman, seemed all too eager to offer help. except that this help came with a catch. I paused, letting the weight of the words settle in. It turns out Charles was working with an American collector, willing to pay handsomely for the manuscript. All he had to do was frame Cameron for the theft and deliver the manuscript to his buyer. A simple plan, but it's not so simple when you're caught. The room was deathly quiet, the tension so thick you could cut it with a knife. Charles's expression was a mix of horror and resignation, his face slack with the dawning realization that his carefully crafted lies were crumbling in front of him. Charles was the one who wanted the manuscript the most, and as the truth unfolded, it was clear just how far he had gone to get his hands on it. The American collector, ready to pay a fortune for Burns's lost work, had promised him everything he needed, an escape from mounting debts, the perfect windfall to restore his crumbling fortunes. A ripple of shock passed through the gathered guests, their faces a mix of disbelief and anger, and I could see Rosalind's grip on Charles's arm slacken as she took in the magnitude of the betrayal. Lord Alister's face turned thunderous, his jaw clenched in rage, while Lady Fiona shut her eyes tightly, bracing for the impact of the storm that had just broken loose. But I wasn't done yet. I pressed on, outlining the cold, calculated scheme that had unfolded under all their noses. The plan had been simple: pin the theft on Cameron, using his gambling debts as a perfect distraction, a smokescreen. But in his haste to hide the manuscript, Charles had made a fatal error. He had left behind a crucial piece of it, enough to follow the trail straight back to him. I saw a strangled cough escape Charles's throat as he stepped forward, his shoulders trembling with the weight of his crumbling facade. "This is absurd," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper, desperately trying to muster the last remnants of his composure. "Why would I?" I raised a hand, silencing him. "I spoke to the housemaid who saw you creeping around the corridors long after you claimed to be asleep," I said coldly, my words cutting through his attempts at deflection. "I spoke to the staff who caught sight of you near the wine cellar, where you hid the rest of the manuscript. And I've got one more tidbit, your own admission, when confronted with the evidence, that you had this American collector on the hook, ready to pay you handsomely for the stolen work." Charles tried to stand tall, his face contorted in disbelief as he attempted to cling to his polished aristocratic persona. But it cracked, shattered like thin ice under the weight of the truth. "I only wanted to pay my debts," he stammered, his voice breaking. "I never meant for Cameron to be truly harmed," but his words were empty, hollow, and Rosalind, looking as if the ground had been ripped out from under her, stepped away from him, her eyes brimming with tears. "You lied to me," she said, her voice shaking with the tremor of disbelief and heartbreak. "You used our family's crisis for your own ends." Charles reached out, as though trying to salvage some semblance of the relationship, but a sharp glare from Lord Alister made him think better of it. The truth was out, and no amount of pleading could change that. As the weight of his betrayal settled over the room, Charles looked around, his gaze meeting disgusted, horrified faces. He knew it was over. The last vestiges of his pride crumbled, and with a defeated cry, he sank to his knees, his words tumbling out in a choked confession. "I was desperate," he admitted, his voice barely audible. "My American ventures collapsed and this collector approached me about the manuscript. The price, it was everything I needed and more. Framing Cameron was just insurance. I knew he'd be suspected anyway, with his debts." His voice cracked as he looked at Rosalind, pleading for forgiveness. "I'm sorry," he whispered, but the words rang hollow. The room was thick with tension, the centuries-old walls of the great hall echoing with the enormity of his betrayal. Lady Fiona clutched her pearls, her face pale and stricken with grief. Lord Alister stood with fists clenched, his posture rigid with anger. Gregory and Mr. Addington hovered by the double doors, wide-eyed, too stunned to move. The air was heavy with the unspoken, a silence that felt more suffocating than any sound. But the truth had to come out, and I wasn't finished. "Where's the rest of the manuscript?" I asked, my voice low and steady, cutting through the stillness. Charles hung his head, the weight of his guilt too much to bear. "In the old wine cellar," he whispered, "behind the last row of barrels." Lord Alistair wasted no time, motioning to a pair of footmen. "Fetch it," he growled. "And make sure Mr. Montgomery doesn't leave your sight." The footman moved swiftly, dragging Charles to his feet, and though he cast one last pleading look at Rosalind, she turned away, wounded, her heart shattered by the man who had manipulated her, used her family's tragedy for his own selfish gain. I exhaled, the tension in my chest finally easing as I realized that every piece of this twisted puzzle had finally clicked into place. The stolen manuscript, the false leads, the frantic attempts to cover tracks, all laid bare under the unyielding spotlight of truth. In the end, the relic that was supposed to save the McAllister family had nearly destroyed them. But in the face of betrayal, the true test of a family was how they weathered the storm. Lord Alistair caught my eye, gratitude and sorrow warring within him. Lady Fiona, her relief palpable, wiped the tears from her face. Cameron, for once, stood tall, as though the weight of suspicion that had plagued him for so long had finally been lifted. "Thank you, Miss Marple," Lord Alistair said quietly, his voice full of sincerity. "We owe you more than we can say." I gave a small nod, my shoulders relaxing as the weight of the case finally slipped away. "All in a day's work," I replied, though it felt as though we had all aged a decade in the process. As Charles Montgomery was led away, the guests stood in stunned silence, whispers beginning to spread like wildfire, the reality of what had just transpired settling in. The stolen manuscript would be returned, the McAllister name, at least for now, protected. Yet the echoes of betrayal would linger, reverberating through the halls of this ancient house, long after the last of the guests had gone. The weight of the moment hung heavy in the air, a tension so thick it seemed to press against the very walls of the grand old hall. The flickering torches cast long shadows over the tapestries that told the storied past of the McAllister family, a legacy now teetering on the edge of ruin. I looked over at the gathered crowd, their expressions a mix of disbelief and betrayal, as Charles Montgomery, the disgraced fiancé, stood in the midst of it all, his once immaculate suit now rumpled, a reflection of his shattered ambitions. The silence that followed his confession seemed endless, broken only by the sporadic sputter of torches along the stone walls. I knew this moment well, how greed could tear a family apart, and yet, despite the devastation tonight, justice had spoken. As Charles remained trapped in the cold grip of his own lies, Lord Alistair's voice cracked the silence, low and hoarse with barely contained fury. "Where is it?" he demanded. Charles's voice trembled as he swallowed hard, barely able to speak. "In the cellar," he muttered, and with a resigned nod, we followed him down the narrow twisting stairwell, lit only by the flickering lanterns in our hands. The air grew colder with each step, the silence broken only by the echo of our footsteps on the damp stone, heavy with the weight of secrets long buried. Charles led the way, his wrists bound by two footmen who marched in step with his every faltering move, their eyes cold with judgment. Every now and then, he glanced over his shoulder, eyes pleading for mercy, but there was no escape. We reached a heavy wooden door, bound in iron bands, and Charles nodded weakly toward the key hanging on the wall. One of the footmen snatched it down, unlocking the door with a harsh metallic clank. Inside, the cellar smelled of dust, earth, and old forgotten things. The shelves were lined with barrels, their darkened wood seeming to stretch into the gloom. In the dim light of our lanterns, Charles gestured toward a small alcove beneath the rickety shelves. "It's there," he whispered. Lord Alistair stepped forward, his trembling hands reaching out as the footman pulled a crate into the light. I knelt beside it, gently opening the lid, revealing the object of so much turmoil, the Burns manuscript, wrapped in a cloth as old and worn as the secrets it contained. The page with the torn corner, the one I had found hidden in the library, was absent, but the rest of the manuscript appeared to be intact, its authenticity heartbreakingly clear. I let the beam of my flashlight dance over the curling parchment, the faded ink that held within it the power to either restore or destroy the McAllister name. "It's all here," Lord Alistair breathed, his voice a mixture of disbelief and relief. His hands shook as he carefully lifted the manuscript, eyes misting with a mix of gratitude and the weight of all that had transpired. Behind him, Lady Fiona pressed a hand to her mouth, her eyes falling upon the pages that had haunted her dreams for so long. With a soft cry, she crumpled to her knees, tears streaming down her cheeks. "We're saved," she whispered, her voice cracking as the burden of months, maybe even years of fear and uncertainty, finally spilled out in those quiet, desperate words. Cameron knelt beside her, his expression a mixture of shock and relief, one arm gently wrapped around her shoulders as he whispered, "It's all right, Mother, it's going to be all right." Charles, still shackled by his own guilt, looked at them, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm sorry," he said, his gaze meeting Rosalind's, but the hurt in her eyes was enough to silence him. She said nothing, offering no forgiveness, no reprieve. I bent down, running my fingers over the manuscript's edges, examining the ink, the paper, the old Scots dialect, carefully preserved in every word. It seemed genuine enough, but the truth of its origins would need to be authenticated. "If it's real," I murmured, "the McAllisters might just escape the grave." Charles nearly dug for them. Lord Alistair turned to me, his face a picture of gratitude, though tinged with the weariness of everything they had endured. "Miss Marple," he said quietly, "I don't know how to thank you. You've done more than recover our treasure, you've saved our family." I gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, my shoulders finally easing from the tension that had weighed me down for so long. "All in a day's work," I replied, though the truth was far from simple. This case had been a tempest, a storm of deception and lies, but in the end, justice had triumphed. Charles didn't meet my gaze as the footman led him away, his eyes locked on the floor, unable to bear the weight of the judgment that hung in the air. It was now up to the family, and the law, to decide how to deal with him. Lady Fiona, with Cameron's help, rose slowly from the floor, brushing away the tears still staining her cheeks, attempting to regain some semblance of composure. She gazed at the manuscript, as though it were the key to a second chance for the McAllister name. "We'll have it authenticated properly," she said, her voice steadying, though the shadows of doubt and pain still lingered. The chill of the night seemed to deepen as Rosalind's voice broke through the lingering silence, a steady resolve threading through her words. No more hiding, no more secrets. Her gaze flickered to Charles, standing like a broken man, his shoulders sagging under the weight of his own shame. She moved toward him, her every step betraying the struggle within her, torn between the anger that threatened to consume her, and the heartbreak that still had its claws in her heart. She reached for him one last time, but the words that escaped her lips were quiet, almost a whisper. Why? It was a question that would never receive an answer capable of easing the deep wound he had inflicted on her. Her hand trembled, caught in the grip of the past and the present, but at last she let him go. The footman led Charles away, his footsteps echoing into the dark corridor, each one a reminder of the irrevocable path he had chosen. Outside, the wind howled like a restless spirit, mourning the night's revelations, but within the stone walls of the cellar, the storm of the past few days began to settle. We had the manuscript, the truth, and with it, the fractured remnants of a family teetering between the fragile relief of redemption and the irreparable scars left by betrayal. Lord Alistair wrapped the manuscript in cloth again, clutching it to his chest like a lifeline, his hands trembling as if the weight of his family's future rested in those fragile pages. As we climbed back up the narrow stairs, I knew that while the immediate crisis was over, the reverberations would echo through the McAllisters for years to come. Forgiveness wasn't something that could be given easily when trust had been shattered, but at least now the house could breathe, its secrets no longer festering in the dark. The ghosts that haunted these halls would forever be overshadowed by the memory of how close the McAllisters had come to losing everything. The storm that had raged through the estate finally broke just before dawn, leaving behind the cold panic of the night, now a fading memory. Snow flurries dissipated against the grey horizon, and the first weak light of morning stretched across the Highlands like a tentative promise. The manor's great doors creaked open, and Charles Montgomery was led out, his face a mask of grim acceptance, the finality of his fate now unmistakable. 2 local constables, summoned by Lord Alister's insistence, flanked him on either side. Charles didn't resist. His eyes swept the courtyard, perhaps catching the bitter irony of how fate had turned so coldly against him. Cameron stood nearby, his arms crossed against the cold, his face drawn and aged by the events of the last few days. The shame of his gambling debts and the near framing had taken its toll, yet when his gaze met mine, a flicker of gratitude replaced the guilt in his eyes. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice low, almost reverent, "if you hadn't uncovered Charles's scheme, I'd be the one leaving in handcuffs." He extended a hand, a half-smile tugging at his lips. "Thank you." I took his hand, feeling the relief flow through him, his fingers still clammy with the weight of his narrow escape. "You're lucky to have a family who stood by you," I replied quietly, my tone firm. "Try not to test that luck again." He nodded solemnly, a man who had finally understood how close he had come to losing everything. Not far away, Lord Alister and Lady Fiona stood by the archway, the newly recovered Burns manuscript still clutched tightly to Lord Alister's chest, as if it were the only thing keeping him grounded. The colour had returned to Lady Fiona's cheeks, but her eyes still held the weight of sleepless nights and unanswered questions. As Charles was driven away, his figure slowly disappearing into the bleak morning, Lord Alister stepped forward, his voice carrying across the courtyard with an air of quiet gratitude. "Miss Marple," he began, the words heavy in the crisp morning air, but what followed was the beginning of something that felt like both an end and a new beginning for the McAllister family. "I can't begin to repay you," Lord Alister murmured, his voice thick with emotion, his hands trembling as he clutched the manuscript to his chest. "If not for your tenacity, my family's name would be in ruins." Lady Fiona stood beside him, her gaze a mixture of gratitude and guilt, her fingers brushing lightly over her husband's arm, as if seeking solace in his presence. "We've done things we're not proud of," she whispered, her words barely audible, but the weight they carried was undeniable. "But no more secrets. The manuscript will be authenticated properly, and from here on, we'll keep our dealings honest." Her voice quivered slightly, as if the finality of her statement held more weight than she could express. I glanced at the ancient folio, its edges worn and tattered, the cloth barely concealing the time-worn pages that had nearly cost them everything. The gleam in Lord Alister's eyes was unmistakable. Hope, yes, but there was something else there too, a hint of pride, as if he could almost believe the family name would rise from the ashes after all. They had come so close to losing it all, the estate, their reputation, each other. But with dawn's light creeping over the Highlands, there was the faintest promise of a new beginning, of a clean slate, if only they played their cards right this time. I hoisted my small travel case, stepping down the weathered stone steps of the manor, the morning air biting at my skin. A car sat waiting for me, its engine idling in the cold, a puff of steam rising from the exhaust pipe. Gregory, ever the dutiful butler, offered to take my bag, but I kept a firm grip on it, feeling that strange satisfaction that only comes from completing a job on your own terms. As I walked toward the car, Lady Fiona's voice carried to me, soft yet heavy with unspoken words. "Will we see you again, Miss Marple?" she asked. I turned, allowing a faint smile to play at the edges of my lips, the tension of the last few days starting to loosen. "If you plan another Burns night like this one, I'd be surprised if there isn't another twist in store," I replied, my voice light but knowing. "But hopefully next year, it'll be all poetry and no crime." She let out a small laugh, though her eyes were still damp with the remnants of unshed tears. With one final nod, I slid into the back seat of the car, the door shutting softly behind me as the driver pulled away. The estate slowly shrank behind us, the sprawling stone structure becoming nothing more than a dark silhouette against the pale morning sky. I pressed my hand to the cold window, watching as the snowy landscape stretched out before me, my thoughts drifting back to how close the McAllisters had come to losing everything. How a stolen manuscript had almost carved their name into the annals of scandal and shame. But as the Highlands stretched out in front of us, bathed in the soft forgiving light of the rising sun, I couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction settle in my chest. In my line of work, you learn that even the deepest gloom can't withstand the first light of day. The McAllisters had been given a chance to rebuild, a chance to right their wrongs, and that was enough to make any detective's morning a little brighter. Burns' words might fill the banquet next year, but hopefully, there would be no more hidden agendas, no more secrets lurking in the shadows, just poetry, and maybe a little bit of redemption,